The clinking of crystal champagne flutes is a delicate musical sound. In the right environment, under the right circumstances, it is the sound of celebration of milestones reached and promises kept. But at 8:15 p.m. on a crisp October evening, sitting in the dimly lit, velvet-draped alcove of Le Petit Jardin, the most exclusive and astronomically expensive French restaurant in the city, that delicate clinking sounded exactly like a countdown. The private dining room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of low-hanging amber chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of roasted duck, white truffles, and the intoxicating, heavy scent of old money. It was the kind of establishment where menus didn't have prices, and the waitstaff moved with the silent, choreographed precision of ghosts. Across the pristine white linen tablecloth sat my husband, David. He was 58 years old, entirely handsome, and radiating the kind of bulletproof confidence that only a man who believes he has successfully pulled off a massive deception can muster. The thing about being married to a narcissist for 3 decades is that you learn to become the perfect audience. You learn when to nod, when to smile, and when to let them believe they are the smartest person in any room they walk into. Sitting precisely in the center of the table between an untouched artisan breadbasket and a flickering pillar candle was a heavy, ornate silver frame. It was a 35th anniversary gift, prearranged by David to be waiting at the table when we arrived. Inside the gleaming silver border was a photograph of us from a vacation in Aspen 5 years ago. We looked happy. We looked like a wealthy, established, deeply connected American couple in the autumn of their lives. It was a beautiful piece of fiction. The most dangerous lies are the ones framed in silver and placed in the center of the table. Underneath the table, resting heavily on my lap, was something entirely different. It was a thick, unmarked manila envelope. The coarse texture of the paper pressed into the smooth navy silk of my evening gown. It was heavy. It held the weight of 90 pages of meticulously documented legal filings, court orders, and financial forensic reports. It was not a gift. It was a guillotine. Some women would have thrown the wine. Some women would have stood up in the middle of this beautiful restaurant, screamed until their vocal cords tore, and demanded answers they were never going to get. I am not that woman. Hysteria is a luxury for the unprepared. The prepared simply wait. I sat there with my hands folded elegantly over the envelope, my face a mask of pleasant, wifely devotion, watching the man I had built a life with prepare to deliver his final performance. David adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal gray Brioni suit, ensuring his $12,000 Rolex Submariner caught the candlelight just right. He was entirely in his element. He loved an audience, and even though it was just the two of us in the alcove, the attentive sommelier and our dedicated waiter were hovering just close enough to serve as his spectators. He picked up his glass, a $300 pour of Chateau Haut-Brion Bordeaux, and swirled it with practiced, deliberate arrogance. He looked at the deep red liquid, then looked across the table at me. His eyes were crinkled at the corners in a perfect imitation of warmth. He didn't see a woman who knew everything. He saw Margaret, good, reliable, predictable Margaret. The woman who made his coffee, managed his home, and never looked too closely at the bank statements. He banked on my invisibility. He relied on the assumption that a woman over 50 simply fades into the wallpaper of her own life, too tired or too blind to notice the foundation being ripped out from under her. When they stop seeing you, they stop seeing the trap. I took a slow, measured breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. My pulse was a steady, rhythmic 60 beats per minute. I felt no sorrow. I felt no heartbreak. Those emotions had burned out completely months ago, leaving behind a cold, clear, and razor-sharp landscape of pure logic. I watched his throat move as he swallowed. I watched his chest expand as he prepared to speak. Every second that ticked by was a second he still believed he owned the world. I was giving him one last minute of his illusion before I tore it down to the studs. The dignified sommelier took half a step back, respectfully giving us the floor. David cleared his throat, a soft, resonant sound designed to capture my full attention. The smile on his face was sickly sweet, a perfect veneer over the rot underneath. He raised his glass to 35 years of loyalty, entirely unaware that the manila envelope I was about to slide across the white linen tablecloth would leave him penniless by dessert. Before I tell you how a marriage shatters, I need to tell you how it was built. I am Margaret. I am 56 years old, and for the last 2 decades, I have been known primarily as David's wife. I managed a sprawling 5-bedroom colonial in Westchester, Pennsylvania. I sat on the board of the local historical society. I hosted Thanksgiving dinners for 20 people, without ever letting the turkey dry out or the conversation stall. I wore sensible cashmere sweaters, drove a quiet Lexus SUV, and perfected the art of making a very complicated, affluent life look entirely effortless. That is the trap of profound competence. When you do everything flawlessly, people simply assume it costs you nothing. But long before I was the woman maintaining the flawless garden, I was the woman who bought the dirt. You see, David wasn't always the man in the $12,000 suit with a taste for vintage Bordeaux. When we married in 1989, he was a mid-level analyst with grand ambitions and a bank account that couldn't match his expensive taste. By 1991, we were living in a drafty, third-floor walk-up in Manayunk, a neighborhood in Philadelphia that hadn't yet been gentrified. The radiator banged like a tin drum, and the bitter winter wind cut straight through the single-pane windows. Every morning at 5 a.m., I woke up in the freezing dark, boiled water on a temperamental gas stove, and made us 2 mugs of Folgers instant coffee. The smell of that cheap metallic roast still reminds me of pure survival. I didn't mind the cold because I was on fire. I was a regional manager for Pacific Telecom during the absolute boom of the early 90s. I worked 60-hour weeks. I spent 3 days a week on Boeing 737s, flying out of Philadelphia International to secure massive infrastructure contracts in Chicago, Atlanta, and Dallas. I wore structured Navy suits with heavy shoulder pads and commanded rooms full of older men who initially thought I was there to take their lunch orders. I built a formidable career, pulling in 6 figures when that was life-changing money, and I funneled every single commission check, every quarterly performance bonus, right back into our shared checking account. I did it because David wanted his MBA from Wharton. He had the sharp intellect, but we didn't have the pedigree or the trust fund. So I became his trust fund. I paid for his thick textbooks, his staggering tuition, and his necessary networking dinners. I worked myself to the bone so he could sit in polished lecture halls and learn how to run the world. I typed his thesis on a bulky desktop computer at midnight while he slept, exhausted from his studies. The world loves to applaud a self-made man, but if you dig up the foundation of his empire, you will almost always find the exhausted hands of the woman who mixed the concrete. By 1998, the landscape of our lives changed entirely. David graduated, landed a massive executive role at a private equity firm, and the money finally started pouring in like rain. At the same time, we welcomed our first daughter, Sarah, quickly followed by Emily. The brutal logistics of my travel schedule and his new 70-hour work weeks clashed violently. We sat at our small kitchen table one Sunday morning, and the decision was made. It made sense on paper. His earning potential was theoretically limitless. I wanted to be fully present for my girls. I wanted to be the one to read them to sleep, to bandage their scraped knees, to watch them grow up without checking my pager. So I handed in my resignation at Pacific Telecom. I packed my Navy suits into a garment bag and shoved them into the back of the spare bedroom closet. I stepped off the corporate ladder entirely, trusting that the man I was building a life with would catch me. For the next 20 years, I was the invisible scaffolding of David's life. I managed the contractors, the accountants, the daughter's complicated college applications, and the silent grinding machinery of our existence. I made sure his dry cleaning was crisp and his mind was free of domestic burdens so he could focus entirely on acquiring more wealth and more status. Stepping down from a podium doesn't mean you've forgotten how to speak. It simply means you've chosen to listen. But over the years, a dangerous shift occurred in our house. David began to rewrite our history. As his bank account swelled and his title grew longer, his memory grew shorter. He started telling stories at dinner parties about his early hustle. He talked about how he built everything from absolutely nothing, conveniently leaving out the woman who paid the rent while he did it. He started treating me less like a partner and more like a very competent, very quiet employee. I let him. I smiled at the dinner parties. I let him be the king of the castle because my ego didn't require public validation. I knew what I had built. I didn't resent my life. I loved my daughters fiercely, and for a long time, I deeply loved my husband. I thought we had an understanding. I thought we were a team playing different positions on the field. But I made the critical mistake of assuming his silence meant respect, when in reality it meant dismissal. He looked at my soft beige sweaters and my quiet demeanor and forgot the shark I used to be. I was happy to step into the shadows and let David shine as the provider, but stepping back didn't mean I erased my past. A fact David dangerously forgot when he started planning his future without me. Betrayal rarely announces itself with a megaphone. It usually sneaks through the back door, dressed quietly as a minor administrative error. It started on a Tuesday in early March. At exactly 2:14 p.m., my iPhone screen lit up with an automated alert from our joint checking account at Citizens Bank. A withdrawal of $450 had just been processed, with a vague memo line that read simply, "Office Consulting." David was a senior executive. His firm covered all his consulting fees, and he exclusively used heavy metal corporate credit cards for anything related to his job. He never, under any circumstances, dipped into our personal checking for work expenses. I didn't ask him about it, I simply watched. 2 days later, I was sorting the dry cleaning when I picked up his heavy wool topcoat. As I draped it over a wooden hanger, a scent drifted up from the collar. It wasn't his usual Tom Ford cologne, and it certainly wasn't my Chanel No. 5. It was Santal 33, a leathery, sandalwood fragrance that is undeniably trendy, aggressively youthful, and entirely out of place on a 58-year-old private equity executive. Most people see a red flag and immediately demand an explanation, giving the liar a chance to invent a story. I saw a red flag and decided to start digging the hole he would eventually fall into. The following Friday, while David was spending his afternoon playing his weekly 18 holes at the country club, I walked into the attached 3-car garage. It was cold, smelling faintly of motor oil and dormant lawn soil. I went straight to the corner near the spare refrigerator where his backup set of clubs sat in a massive black leather Callaway golf bag. Men like David are predictable. They hide things in places they assume their wives have no interest in exploring. I unzipped the deep side pocket, expecting to push past old scorecards, spare tees, or perhaps a cigar cutter. Instead, my fingers brushed against a thick stack of heavily folded paper documents. I pulled them out. When a man starts hiding paper statements in a digital age, he is trying very hard to conceal a trail of breadcrumbs he knows will lead straight to his guilt. They were bank statements from a private Chase checking account I had never seen before. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the garage. He had been making systematic, rhythmic transfers. Exactly $5,000 on the 1st of the month, another $5,000 on the 15th. The money was being funneled quietly, month after month, into a limited liability company called Blue Heron Holdings. I carefully folded the statements exactly as I had found them, slid them back behind the spare golf gloves, and zipped the bag shut. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. I walked back into my spotless kitchen, washed my hands with warm water and lemon soap, and picked up my phone. I needed a professional. I hired Jim. Jim was a retired Philadelphia police detective who had pivoted to private investigation, operating out of a nondescript strip mall in Conshohocken. He drank his coffee black, didn't ask emotional questions, and possessed the kind of quiet, cynical efficiency I deeply appreciated. 3 weeks later, Jim called me to a corner booth at a local diner. The air smelled of burnt toast and old grease. Without a word of preamble, Jim slid a thick manila folder across the sticky Formica table. "She's 28, Jim rasped, tapping the glossy photographs with a thick, calloused finger. "Her name is Chloe. She's a marketing assistant at a firm in Center City." I looked at the photos. Chloe was wearing expensive yoga pants, carrying an iced matcha latte, and unlocking the front door of a very modern, very expensive property. She was pretty in that generic, highly curated way that costs a lot of money to maintain. "And the house?" I asked softly. Jim slid a piece of paper over the photo. It was a property deed. Townhouse in Northern Liberties. Purchase price was $650,000, bought in cash and private financing under an LLC. Blue Heron Holdings. I paid Jim $3,500 in crisp $100 bills, thanked him for his time, and drove home. Some women fall apart when they find out the truth. I am not that woman. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and started making a list. The infidelity was a cliché. Men of his age and tax bracket buy mistresses the way they buy sports cars, because they are terrified of becoming obsolete. I could survive his ego needing a 28-year-old cheerleader. But what happened the following week moved the situation from a marital tragedy to a financial war. It was late April. We were sitting in his mahogany-paneled home office. The evening was quiet. The only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. David casually looked up from his laptop, taking off his reading glasses with a practiced, casual ease. "Maggie," he said, using his gentlest, most reassuring voice, "I moved some funds around today. The market's been volatile, so I took the $300,000 we had in the Vanguard joint savings and locked it into a 5-year municipal bond. Much safer for our retirement." I felt the air leave the room. The Vanguard account was our high-yield safety net. It was the money I had helped seed decades ago, the cushion we had agreed would always remain liquid. I looked him directly in the eyes. "A 5-year lock?" I asked, my voice perfectly level. Are you sure that's wise, David? Trust me, he smiled, reaching over to pat my hand with warm, dry fingers. I'm just making sure we're secure. It is a uniquely terrifying experience to watch the man you loved smile at you while he quietly holds a knife to your financial throat. He wasn't protecting our retirement. He was liquidating me. He was quietly draining the accessible marital assets so that when he inevitably served me with divorce papers to go play house with Chloe, I would be left with a mortgage I couldn't afford and bank accounts that read zero. He thought I was a passenger in a car he was driving off a cliff, entirely blind to the missing brakes. If you've ever had to smile through a betrayal while you quietly gathered your strength, take a moment to subscribe. We women know how to bide our time. I didn't blink. I didn't let the smile drop from my face. I simply nodded, told him he was brilliant, and asked what he wanted for dinner. I watched him pack his leather briefcase, kiss a cheek with the exact same smile he'd worn for 3 decades, and I realized my husband wasn't just having a midlife crisis. He was systematically trying to bankrupt me. When a man quietly declares financial war on you, your first instinct is to panic. Your second instinct, if you are smart, is to find a mercenary. I didn't need a therapist, and I didn't need a shoulder to cry on. I needed Eleanor. Eleanor was a 65-year-old estate and divorce attorney whose office sat in a stately brick colonial in Bryn Mawr. She wore immaculate tweed suits, drank Earl Grey tea from delicate bone china cups, and had spent the last 30 years legally dissecting arrogant men with the precision of a neurosurgeon. The most dangerous women in the world are never the ones who raise their voices. They are the ones who take notes. I sat in Eleanor's leather wingback chair on a rainy Tuesday morning and laid out the golf bag bank statements, Jim's private investigator photos, and the Vanguard withdrawal slips. Eleanor didn't gasp or offer me a tissue. She simply put on her reading glasses, reviewed the documents for 10 silent minutes, and then smiled a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. We had work to do. While Eleanor began hunting down the paper trail of David's LLC, I had my own retrieval mission to execute. The following Wednesday, David left for a regional banking conference in Boston, which Jim confirmed was actually a 3-day staycation at Chloe's townhouse. At exactly 10:15 a.m., I pulled down the creaky wooden stairs to our attic. The air up there was thick with the smell of old dust, dry pine beams, and forgotten history. I navigated past boxes of old Christmas ornaments and the girls' elementary school art projects until I reached the far corner under the eaves. Tucked beneath a heavy wool blanket was a gray, sentry-safe fireproof lockbox. I blew the dust off the top, dialed in the combination, and popped the heavy latch. Inside, beneath our old passports and the girls' birth certificates, was a thick stack of yellowing paper. It was my Pacific Telecom corporate pension file, printed on old dot matrix paper from the late 90s. When I left my career in 1998, I had accumulated a massive, separate corporate pension because I was a top-tier regional manager pulling in exceptional commissions. I never merged it with David's accounts. I simply left it alone to grow. For 25 years, through market booms and compound interest, that untouched account sitting solely in my maiden name had quietly swelled to just over $1.4 million. David had entirely forgotten it existed. Arrogance is a highly effective anesthetic. It completely numbs a man to the reality of his own vulnerability. Because David had spent 2 decades convincing himself that he was the sole architect of our wealthy lifestyle, he had successfully erased my past financial contributions from his memory. He didn't just forget my money, he forgot my competence. By the time I brought the pension paperwork to Eleanor, she had finished untangling the web of Blue Heron Holdings. What she found was a mistake so catastrophically stupid, it almost made me laugh out loud in her pristine office. To buy Chloe's townhouse for $650,000 without applying for a traditional mortgage that you would see, Eleanor explained, tapping a manicured fingernail against a dense legal printout. David had to secure private financing, and to get that shadow loan, he had to put up collateral. He hadn't used our house because my name was on the deed. Instead, he had illegally pledged his entire executive 401(a) and separate corporate retirement accounts as direct collateral for the Mistress's mortgage. He tied his entire financial future to that townhouse to avoid leaving a paper trail in our joint mail. A man hiding a mistress will always choose the path of least visibility, even if it leads him straight into a minefield. The trap was fully built. All that was left was to spring it. On Friday, October 12th at 3:45 p.m., just hours before David and I were scheduled to celebrate our 35th anniversary at Le Petit Jardin, Eleanor walked into a family court judge's chambers. Presenting the evidence of David's massive dissipation of marital assets, she filed a quiet ex parte order. It was an immediate emergency legal freeze on every single one of David's financial accounts. Spoken with a slight, knowing smile. Make sure to subscribe if you believe the best revenge isn't screaming, but a perfectly executed legal document. At 5 p.m., I stood in front of my bedroom mirror. The house was dead silent. I slipped into a tailored navy silk evening gown, feeling the cool, heavy fabric settle against my skin. I applied a soft red lipstick, clipped on my pearl earrings, and picked up the thick manila envelope Eleanor had couriered over an hour prior. He thought he was leaving me with a dusty, aging house and a drained checking account, but as I zipped up my navy evening gown for our anniversary dinner, I knew I was walking out with the keys to his entire existence. We were back in the warm, amber glow of the velvet-draped alcove at Le Petit Jardin. The air hummed with the quiet, expensive murmur of the main dining room just beyond our curtains. David, still standing with his posture impeccably straight, cleared his throat. Jean-Luc, our distinguished, silver-haired sommelier, took a respectful half-step backward, blending into the shadows of the room. The stage was perfectly set. "To Margaret," David began, his voice dripping with a practiced, honeyed sincerity that made my stomach turn. "The woman who stood by me when I had absolutely nothing. To 35 years of building an empire together, to your unwavering loyalty, and to the golden years ahead of us. The cruelest lies are the ones told with a warm smile and a raised glass of expensive wine. I didn't reach for my glass of the $300 Chateau Haut-Briand. I didn't offer the polite, adoring, wifely smile he had banked on for decades. Instead, I placed my hands flat on the table, right next to the heavy silver anniversary frame. With slow, deliberate precision, I pushed the thick manila envelope across the pristine white linen. It glided silently, stopping perfectly centered, just inches from his Limoges porcelain dinner plate. "I think you'll find the contents of this much more compelling than the vintage," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. David looked confused. His perfect, confident smile faltered just a fraction of an inch, the corners of his mouth twitching as confusion briefly overrode his arrogance. He set his wineglass down, his $12,000 Rolex flashing under the amber chandelier, and broke the seal on the envelope. He pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. There is a specific, deeply satisfying silence that falls over a room when a liar realizes he has finally run out of shadows. The first page was Jim's high-definition 8x10 photograph of Chloe. She was wearing her expensive yoga pants, carrying her iced matcha latte, and unlocking the front door of the Northern Liberties townhouse. David's eyes locked onto the image, his pupils dilating in pure shock. Before he could formulate a lie, I nodded toward the stack. "Keep reading, David." He flipped to the second page. It was the emergency ex parte order, signed in stark black ink by Judge Harrison at exactly 3:45 p.m. in that very afternoon. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the dense legal jargon. It took him exactly 20 seconds to comprehend the absolute destruction of his reality. He realized the freeze was total. His executive 401A, his Chase private checking account, the Vanguard funds he had locked up away from me, all of it was entirely frozen by the court. And then came the catastrophic realization of the collateral. With his accounts legally locked by the judge, his shadow lender for Blue Heron Holdings was going to immediately call in the loan. He was personally on the hook for a $650,000 mortgage on his mistress's townhouse, and he couldn't access a single solitary dime to pay it. A man can build a towering empire of deceit, but the math will always collect its debts in the end. But Eleanor, my brilliant attorney, had included one final document in the stack. It was the mandatory preliminary disclosure of my separate assets for the divorce filing. David turned to the fourth page and stared at the bold, undeniable print at the bottom of the ledger. There it was, the Pacific Telecom corporate pension account. Balance, $1,412,000. It was completely secure, entirely in my name, and legally untouchable by him because he had spent 25 years pretending my career never existed. Right on cue, his iPhone, sitting face up next to his water glass, began to violently vibrate against the wood. The screen lit up, Mark Reynolds, broker. The phone buzzed aggressively, stopped, and immediately began vibrating again. The financial system was locking him out in real time. His entire world was collapsing while he sat in a velvet alcove, smelling of roasted duck and Santal 33. David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the hollow, ashen color of old parchment. He started to hyperventilate, his chest heaving under his tailored charcoal suit. His fingers frantically tore at his silk brioni tie, loosening it as if the room had suddenly run out of oxygen. He looked across the table at me, his eyes wide and terrified. silently begging for the woman who always fixed his problems to fix this one. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just sat perfectly still and watched him suffocate on his own consequences. The commotion drew the attention of Jean-Luc. The sommelier glided back over to the table, taking in the aggressively vibrating phone, the scattered legal papers, and David's sheer, unadulterated panic. Jean-Luc possessed the impeccable discretion of a man who had spent 40 years serving the elite. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply looked down at my gasping husband, then looked directly at me with a perfectly neutral expression. "Shall I box up the rest of the meal for you, madame?" Jean-Luc asked softly, pointedly ignoring David. "It seems the gentleman has suddenly lost his appetite." "Yes, thank you, Jean-Luc," I replied evenly, picking up my leather clutch. "And please put the entire bill on his corporate card." "He insists." He looked at me, a man drowning in his own arrogance, finally realizing that the woman he thought he had outsmarted was the one who controlled the water level. The divorce was not a battle, it was an autopsy. When you freeze a man's assets, you don't just stop his spending, you expose every single fracture in the foundation of his life. The shadow lender who financed Blue Heron Holdings called in the loan within 72 hours of the judge signing the order. Because David's executive accounts were locked by the court and heavily penalized by the IRS for early, illegal collateralization, the property immediately fell into foreclosure. It is remarkable how quickly 28-year-old marketing assistants discover irreconcilable differences when the cash flow abruptly stops. Chloe packed her expensive yoga pants and vacated the Northern Liberties townhouse less than 2 weeks later, leaving David alone with a 6-figure debt and a collapsing reputation. A man's ego is a fragile balloon. Once you puncture it with financial ruin, there is nothing left but the sad, wrinkled rubber of who he actually is. Today, David lives in a rented second-floor studio apartment near the airport, listening to the deafening roar of commercial jets overhead. His $12,000 Rolex Submariner was quietly sold to cover his mounting legal fees. His remaining legally dissected retirement funds were entirely liquidated to pay massive tax penalties, and the final, ironclad divorce settlement Eleanor ruthlessly negotiated on my behalf. I did not take a penny more than I was owed. I didn't have to. The math ruined him long before the judge ever banged the gavel. But that is the end of David's story, not mine. The camera of my life no longer focuses on his failures. It is a Tuesday morning in late May. The sprawling colonial in Westchester is perfectly quiet, but it is a warm, breathable quiet. The soft golden sunlight is streaming through the massive glass windows of my sunroom, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. I am standing at my wooden workbench. My hands, now entirely free of my heavy diamond wedding band, are dusted with dark, rich potting soil. The greatest luxury wealth can buy isn't a silver anniversary frame or an expensive French meal. It is the absolute peace of a life, completely under your own control. I carefully lift my late grandmother's delicate purple African violets from their old, cramped plastic containers. Their roots are remarkably strong, having survived decades of shifting environments and changing seasons. I gently repot them into sturdy, new terracotta pots, pressing the damp earth down around the base so they can breathe, so they can finally spread out. Beside me on the bench sits a heavy ceramic mug. I wipe the dirt from my hands, pick it up, and take a slow, deep sip of hot black coffee. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's just the sound of a woman letting a foolish man dig his own grave. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.